When did your marriage end in less than 24 hours? I should have realized something was off while my wife Raven walked down the aisle. Her family were wearing matching silver pins and kept exchanging these knowing looks. The ceremony itself felt weird too. Raven had insisted on adding strange phrases to our vows about ascending together and fulfilling sacred obligations. My parents sat in the front row beaming at us like this was the happiest day of their lives. After the reception, Raven said she had a surprise for me. Instead of heading to our honeymoon suite, she drove us to this compound outside the city. She said her extended family wanted to throw us a private celebration. The building looked like a converted warehouse with no windows and security cameras everywhere. Inside, there were about 50 people all wearing those same silver pins. They formed a circle around us and started chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Raven held my hand tightly and whispered, I should just go along with everything. Then this older woman stepped forward and introduced herself as the elder mother. She congratulated Raven on completing her third-tier obligation. I had no idea what that meant, but everyone started applauding. The elder mother then turned to me and said I was blessed to be chosen for such an important role. What role? Raven squeezed my hand harder and gave me a look that said to stay quiet. The elder mother explained that Raven had proven her dedication by bringing a genetically suitable partner into the fold. They led us to a smaller room where 5 other men were waiting. They all looked about my age and just as confused as I felt. Raven kissed my cheek and said she'd explain everything soon. Then she left me there with these strangers while she went to change into some kind of ceremonial robe. One of the guys named Cordell said he'd married Raven 6 months ago. Another named Abdil said their wedding was last year. As we compared stories, the horrible truth started coming together. We'd all married Raven in different states under slightly different names. We were all her husbands, and none of us had known about the others. Before we could process this insanity, Raven returned with the elder mother and several other robed women. They explained that Raven was a sacred vessel whose destiny was to birth the next generation of leaders. But first, they needed to determine which husband would provide the strongest offspring. Basically, find out who had the best nut. This is insane, I said. I want a divorce. Right now. The elder mother smiled like I'd told a joke. She explained that leaving wasn't an option now. The marriage was binding not just legally, but spiritually. Raven looked at me with cold eyes that showed no trace of the woman I thought I'd fallen in love with. The other husbands were starting to panic too. Cordell tried to leave, but 2 large men blocked the door. The women started explaining the competition rules. We'd live in the compound for 30 days, being tested on everything from physical strength to intelligence to seeing which nut cells survived the longest. The winner would father Raven's child, while the losers would be reassigned to other roles in the organization. They showed us to a dormitory where we'd be staying. 6 beds in one room like some twisted summer camp. The next morning, they woke us at dawn for physical assessments. During lunch, I managed to pull Cordell aside. He'd been there the longest and seemed the most resigned to the situation. He told me Raven had 12 husbands total, but only 6 were competing. The others had already failed previous competitions and been reassigned to manual labor around the compound. How is this even legal? I asked. Cordell shrugged and said the organization had lawyers and politicians in their pocket. The marriages were all legal in their respective states. Nobody on the outside would believe our story anyway. We were stuck. That evening, they gathered everyone in the main hall for dinner. Raven sat at the head table with the elder mother, while us husbands ate separately. I noticed my parents enter the room and my heart jumped, thinking they'd come to save me. I started to stand up to run to them, but they walked right past me to the head table. My mother kissed the elder mother on both cheeks like old friends. My father shook hands with other robed figures and laughed at their jokes. They were both wearing those silver pins I'd noticed at the wedding. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They'd known. Every family dinner and holiday gathering had been a lie. They'd raised me specifically for this purpose. My own parents had orchestrated everything from the moment I was born. Raven caught my eye from across the room and smiled. Not with love or affection, but with the satisfaction of a mission accomplished. My mother waved at me like this was all perfectly normal. My father raised his glass in a toast to the sacred vessel and her chosen competitors. I sank back into my chair as the full weight of my situation crashed down on me. This wasn't just about a failed marriage or a con artist wife. This was my entire life revealed as an elaborate trap set by the people I trusted most. And based on the armed guards at every exit, I was never getting out. The elder mother stood up to make an announcement. She said the competition would officially begin tomorrow, and may the strongest genes win. Then she looked directly at me with those cold, calculating eyes. Your parents are so proud of you, Benjamin. They've been preparing you for this moment since before you were even born. My whole body went cold and I couldn't move or breathe or think straight. The room spun around me while everyone kept eating and talking like this was normal. My hands shook so bad I had to grip the edge of the table to steady them. The other husbands stared at me with a mix of pity and relief that it wasn't their parents up there. I forced myself to nod at elder mother and tried to smile even though I wanted to throw up. My mother blew me a kiss from the head table and went back to her conversation. The guards watched me carefully like they expected me to bolt for the door any second. I picked up my fork and made myself take a bite of the cold mashed potatoes on my plate. Elder mother sat back down and dinner continued while my world fell apart in complete silence. After what felt like hours, they finally dismissed us back to the dormitory for the night. Cordell walked close beside me, and Abdil stayed right behind us as we filed out. The guards followed us down the hallway and stood outside our door after we went in. The room had 6 beds lined up against the walls with thin gray blankets and flat pillows. We sat on our beds in silence for a few minutes before anyone dared to speak. Cordell finally scooted closer to my bed, and Abdil joined us in the corner furthest from the door. We huddled together and kept our voices barely above whispers, knowing they probably had cameras watching. Cordell told us about another guy who tried to fight back during his first week here. They dragged him away and nobody saw him for 3 days until he came back different. Abdil said we needed to stick together and share anything we learned about this place. I nodded along, but my mind kept going back to my parents sitting at that table. We agreed to watch each other's backs even though we all knew this was a competition. Trust felt dangerous, but being alone here felt worse, so we shook on it anyway. The lights clicked off at exactly 10 o'clock and plunged us into total darkness. I lay there staring at nothing and listening to the other men breathing and shifting in their beds. My parents had been planning this my whole life, and I never suspected anything at all. Every birthday party and family vacation had been part of some sick plan I couldn't understand. Sleep finally came, but it brought nightmares about silver pins and ceremonial robes and my mother's smile. Someone shook me awake before dawn, and I saw guards standing in the doorway with flashlights. They ordered us to get dressed and line up in the hallway for orientation. Elder Mother waited for us in a conference room with charts and diagrams covering the walls. She explained our sacred duty to preserve the bloodline and create the next generation of leaders. Her voice stayed calm and pleasant, like she was teaching a Sunday school class, not imprisoning people. She mentioned that men who failed the competition or resisted got reassigned to manual labor positions. The way she said manual labor made it sound like something much worse than just working. Some of the husbands asked questions, but she only answered with vague spiritual explanations that didn't make sense. After 2 hours of this propaganda session, they marched us to a medical examination room. They lined us up against the wall while nurses set up equipment and clipboards full of forms. A huge man stood by the door watching us with cold eyes that never blinked or looked away. Someone whispered that his name was Garrison Hyde, and he handled security for the whole compound. His arms were thick as tree trunks, and he had scars on his knuckles from old fights. When one husband took too long undressing for the exam, Garrison stepped forward without saying a word. The guy immediately started moving faster, and Garrison went back to his spot by the door. They measured our height and weight and took blood samples and made us run on treadmills. The nurses wrote down everything in their charts while Elder Mother supervised from a chair in the corner. My knee still hurt from an old injury, and I tried to hide the limp during the fitness test. Garrison noticed, though, and made a note on his clipboard that made my stomach drop. After the physical tests, they gave us lunch in the main hall again, keeping us separated from everyone else. Raven sat at the head table wearing a white dress that made her look like some kind of angel. My parents sat near her, chatting and laughing with the other robed figures around them. I wanted to stand up and scream at them, but I knew that would only make things worse. The food tasted like cardboard, but I forced myself to eat every bite to keep my strength up. That evening at dinner, the same separation continued with us eating at our own table. My parents walked past me again without even making eye contact this time. The betrayal burned worse than anything I'd ever felt before in my entire life. After dinner, I approached one of the guards and asked if I could speak with my parents. Elder Mother appeared immediately, like she'd been waiting for someone to try this exact thing. She put her hand on my shoulder and squeezed just hard enough to hurt a little bit. She told me family meetings weren't allowed during the competition period because they could create unfair advantages. Commitment required sacrifice, she said, and I should focus on my sacred duty instead of earthly attachments. I wanted to scream at her, but I just nodded and walked back to the dormitory. That night, the guards came through our room doing a security check around midnight. They searched under our mattresses and checked the bathroom for hidden items before leaving us in darkness again. I barely slept thinking about my parents' betrayal and what tomorrow would bring. The wake-up bell rang at 5:30, and we stumbled out of bed to get dressed for whatever came next. After a quick breakfast of oatmeal and toast, they marched us into a conference room I hadn't seen before. A woman in a gray suit stood at the front with a stack of papers thick as a phone book. She introduced herself as Suzanne Howard, the organization's legal counsel, and started passing out forms for us to sign. The papers had lots of small print about voluntary participation and waiving our right to sue for any reason. She explained everything in this calm voice that made it sound like we had a choice, while her eyes made it clear we didn't. Consent forms for medical testing and psychological evaluation and property transfer and a dozen other things I couldn't fully understand. NDAs that would cost us millions if we ever talked about what happened here. I stared at the signature lines while my hand shook holding the pen. Suzanne noticed my hesitation and walked over to stand behind my chair. She leaned down and whispered that refusing to sign would be considered breach of our marriage contract with serious legal consequences. Her breath smelled like coffee and mint gum. I signed my name on every page while my stomach twisted into knots. After the briefing, they let us use the bathroom, and I noticed an office door was open down the hall. Inside, I could see a phone on the desk and my heart started racing. I pretended to look for paper towels while slowly moving toward the office. My fingers had just touched the phone when Garrison Hyde appeared in the doorway, like he'd been waiting for me. He put his huge hand on my shoulder and squeezed just enough to hurt. "Bathrooms are that way," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. His grip tightened when I tried to explain about the paper towels. "Best to stay in approved areas, Benjamin. Wouldn't want any misunderstandings." I nodded and walked back to the bathroom while he watched every step I took. That afternoon, they had us doing more physical tests in the medical wing. We were running on treadmills when the guy next to me, one of the newer husbands, suddenly stopped and started gasping for air. His face turned red and he fell to his knees, clutching his chest. 2 guards grabbed him under the arms and dragged him out while he kept saying he couldn't breathe. They took him to what they called a reflection room for evaluation. When he came back 3 hours later, his eyes looked empty and his hands wouldn't stop shaking. He wouldn't tell us what happened in there no matter how many times we asked. That night after dinner, I sat on my bed with the lucky coin I'd hidden in my shoe. Using a pencil stub I'd found under my mattress, I wrote, "I am Benjamin" on a scrap of toilet paper. It was stupid, but I needed something to remind myself who I was when everything else felt fake. I folded the paper tiny and tucked it in my shoe next to the coin. The next morning during breakfast, Elder Mother stood up to make an announcement. She said we'd have a supervised family meal in 3 days where we could see our relatives. My heart jumped, thinking maybe I could slip my parents a note or signal for help somehow. But then she explained the rules and my hope died. We'd sit at separate tables with guards between us, and conversation would be limited to approved topics. Any attempt at inappropriate communication would result in immediate separation. The testing got worse over the next 2 days, with blood draws every few hours and fitness evaluations that left us exhausted. While they poked and prodded us, I watched the guards and memorized their patterns. They changed shifts at exactly 6 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 10 at night. Always the same 3 guards rotating through the same doors using the same 4-digit codes. During a break, I found that thick manual they'd given us and started reading the parts I'd skipped before. There were whole sections about bloodline preservation and genetic optimization that made me want to throw up. Charts showing breeding schedules and offspring potential ratings. Pages of theory about creating superior children through selective matching. This wasn't just about control, it was a whole eugenics program dressed up with religious words. That evening, Cordell pulled me aside while we were cleaning up after dinner. He looked around to make sure no one was listening, and then whispered about the men who got reassigned after failing competitions. They got sent to work camps the organization ran in other states doing farm labor and construction. Some of them were never heard from again, and their families were told they'd chosen to start new lives. His brother-in-law had been reassigned 2 years ago, and nobody had seen him since. The next morning, they presented us with another stack of medical consent forms for procedures I didn't understand. When I hesitated before signing, Suzanne appeared out of nowhere like she'd been watching. She sat down next to me and explained in her lawyer voice how refusing could be seen as breach of contract. The organization had invested significant resources in us and expected cooperation. Fighting them would result in lawsuits that would destroy our families financially. I thought about my parents and realized they'd probably lose everything if I didn't play along. I signed the papers while hate burned in my chest. That night after lights out, Desmond started examining the walls and ceiling with a small flashlight he'd hidden somehow. He waved me over and pointed at tiny holes in the air vents above each bed. "Microphones," he mouthed without making a sound. We checked the whole room and found them everywhere, even in the bathroom. From then on, we developed hand signals and wrote notes on scraps of paper to communicate anything important. Real conversations only happened outside during supervised walks, where wind might cover our voices. The next morning during the guard shift change at 6, I pretended to tie my shoe near the main door while watching Garrison punch in the code. My heart pounded as I caught the first 3 numbers, 7, 3, and something, then 9 at the end. I repeated 7, 3, something 9 in my head over and over while walking back to the dorm, burning it into my memory. 2 days later in the kitchen, I told the worker preparing lunch that I had severe nut allergies and needed to check the ingredient lists on everything. She rolled her eyes but let me look at the boxes while she chopped vegetables. When she turned to grab more carrots, I quickly scribbled, "Help trapped, call police" on a tiny piece of paper and shoved it deep into one of the delivery crates heading back to the supplier. My hands shook so bad I almost dropped the pen, but I managed to stack other boxes on top before she looked back. That afternoon, Raven found me alone in the hallway outside the bathroom and blocked my path with her body. She started explaining the breeding program like she was teaching a class, talking about genetic markers and bloodline tracking and optimal combinations for creating superior offspring. Her voice stayed calm and scientific while she described destroying people's lives and forcing them into this sick experiment. She showed me charts on her tablet with DNA sequences and probability calculations and breeding schedules that made me want to throw up. I just stood there nodding while she went on about recessive genes and dominant traits and how they'd been tracking my family's genetics for 3 generations. 3 nights later, they burst into our dorm at exactly 3 in the morning, screaming for us to get dressed for an emergency drill. My brain was still foggy from sleep, and I fumbled with my shirt buttons while guards yelled about moving faster. Cordell and Abdil were already dressed and standing at attention, but I was still trying to find my shoes when Garrison grabbed my arm. He dragged me to the kitchen and pointed at the floor, telling me slow response times meant punishment duty. I spent the next 4 hours on my hands and knees scrubbing grease off tiles with a tiny brush while he watched from the doorway. My back ached and my knees were raw by the time he finally let me return to the dorm for a 20-minute nap before regular wake-up. While cleaning under the prep station, I spotted a clipboard someone had kicked behind the refrigerator. I pulled it out carefully and saw donor records with names and amounts and dates going back years. My parents' names jumped out at me immediately, listed as founding members with a gold star next to their entry. The numbers next to their names made my stomach drop. $300,000 over 15 years, plus something called legacy contributions. They'd been funding this place since before I was even in high school. I shoved the clipboard back where I found it, but those numbers stayed burned in my mind. 2 mornings later, they woke us before dawn and loaded us into a white van with no windows in the back. I counted every turn we made, left then right then straight for what felt like 10 minutes, then another left. At each stoplight, I tried to peek through the tiny gap in the partition to see street signs or landmarks. We stopped after exactly 23 minutes at a medical building that looked normal from the outside. During the stress test, the treadmill suddenly sparked and started smoking while I was running full speed. The technician yanked me off before I fell and rushed to unplug the machine while nurses came running to check if I was hurt. In the chaos, I saw a paperclip on the desk and palmed it quickly, sliding it into my sock while everyone focused on the smoking equipment. That night after lights out, I used the paperclip to work on the supply closet lock near the laundry room. It took me 40 minutes of careful wiggling, but finally the cheap lock clicked open. Inside, I found cleaning supplies and linens, but also a forgotten notepad and 2 pens that someone must have left months ago. I grabbed them and relocked the door, then hid my prizes inside a gap between the washing machine and the wall where nobody would think to look. Over the next 3 nights, I stayed up sketching everything I could remember about the compound layout. I drew the main hallway with all the doors, marked where each camera was mounted, noted which guards worked which shifts and what routes they walked. If I ever got out, this map might be the evidence that helped shut this nightmare down. Desmond found me one night and studied my drawings carefully before pointing to a spot near the loading dock. We'd both noticed that delivery bay only had 1 camera, and it had a blind spot near the truck entrance where the angle couldn't quite reach. We whispered about whether we could hide in one of the supply trucks during a delivery, but the risk was massive since we didn't know where they went or when they'd stop. Still, we were both getting desperate enough that even terrible odds looked better than staying trapped forever. The next morning, a guard handed me an envelope with my name typed on it. Inside was a letter from someone named Suzanne Howard on official legal letterhead. She was threatening to sue me for defamation if I ever spoke publicly about the organization or made any false claims. I hadn't even escaped yet, and they were already preparing to silence me. My hands shook as I read through all the legal terms about damages and injunctions and breach of contract. Desmond read it over my shoulder and said he'd gotten one too when he first arrived. They wanted us to know we were trapped not just physically, but legally too. Later that afternoon, I was mopping the hallway outside Elder Mother's office when I heard her on the phone. She was talking about a state senator visiting next week to see their community wellness programs. She mentioned showing him the dormitories and the medical facilities and how important it was to present everything properly. The corruption went even higher than I imagined if they had senators coming for tours. I kept mopping slowly to hear more details about the visit schedule. 3 days later, the senator actually showed up with 2 assistants and a photographer. Elder Mother led them through the main areas while we were told to look busy and happy. I saw my chance when they passed near the dining hall and started walking toward the senator. Before I got within 10 feet, Garrison Hyde appeared out of nowhere and put his hand on my shoulder. He told the senator I was just eager to share my positive experience here, but needed to get back to my duties. The senator barely looked at me before moving on with the tour. Later, Garrison pulled me aside and warned that disruptions had consequences, and I wouldn't like finding out what those were. The threat in his voice made my stomach turn. A week passed before I decided to try something else. During breakfast, I started holding my stomach and groaning about sharp pains. I doubled over and said I thought something was really wrong. They loaded me into the medical van, but instead of a real hospital, they drove me to their controlled clinic. The nurse there barely looked at me before handing me some antacids and saying it was just stress. I tried to tell her I needed real medical attention, but she just smiled and said the compound had excellent care. Within an hour, they drove me back without ever seeing a real doctor. The family meal they'd promised finally happened 2 weeks later. My parents sat across from me at a long table with other families, while guards stood at every door. The food was fancy, and everyone acted like this was perfectly normal. When the busser came to clear plates, I'd already written, "Help trapped, call police" on a napkin. I managed to slip it onto his tray when nobody was looking, but my hands shook so bad I almost dropped my fork. My mother asked if I was feeling all right, and I forced myself to smile and say everything was fine. 2 days later, I heard commotion in the main hall and saw 2 police officers talking to Elder Mother. My heart jumped, thinking maybe the busser had actually called, but then I saw the calm way she was showing them paperwork. She called us all into the common room and explained the officers were just doing a routine wellness check. With guards watching every move, the officers asked if we were here voluntarily and if we needed any assistance. I wanted to scream the truth, but Garrison stood right behind me. The officers looked around for maybe 20 minutes before thanking Elder Mother for her cooperation and leaving. I felt completely defeated watching them drive away. During our next clinic visit for blood work, I went to use the bathroom and saw a poster on the wall. It had a domestic violence hotline number in big letters at the bottom. I stared at it and repeated the numbers over and over until they burned into my memory. It said the hotline was for women, but maybe they'd help anyone being controlled and abused. Back in the exam room, I noticed the nurse had left her cell phone on the counter while she went to get supplies. I grabbed it and dialed the number as fast as I could. When someone answered, I whispered my name was Benjamin, and I was being held against my will at a compound. I only got about 30 seconds to explain before I heard footsteps coming back. I hung up and put the phone back just as the nurse walked in. She didn't seem to notice anything wrong and continued with the blood draw. A week later, during another clinic visit, the desk phone rang while the nurse was with another patient. She asked me to answer it and tell them to call back. When I picked up, a woman said she was Kirsten Greco from the hotline and asked if I was Benjamin. I whispered yes, and she started talking fast about safety planning and documenting everything. She said she knew a journalist named Imani Fields who was investigating groups like this and could maybe help. The nurse started coming back, so Kirsten quickly told me to memorize her direct number and call whenever I could. I repeated it back once and hung up just as the nurse walked in. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about finally having someone on the outside who believed me. 3 days later, my parents showed up for an unscheduled visit looking upset. My father pulled me aside and said Suzanne Howard had contacted them about my behavior. She was threatening to expose some financial crimes they'd committed years ago if I kept causing problems. My mother said they'd invested everything in this organization, and I needed to stop being selfish. I couldn't believe they were choosing the cult over their own son, but here they were pressuring me to cooperate. My father said I was embarrassing the family and destroying everything they'd worked for. Neither of them asked if I was okay or what I was going through. They just wanted me to shut up and play along so their precious organization wouldn't punish them. The next morning, my father came back alone and asked to speak with me privately in the conference room. He sat across from me and started talking about superior genetics and how some bloodlines were meant to lead while others served. The words coming out of his mouth sounded like something from old Nazi propaganda films we'd watched in history class. He explained how the organization had been tracking family lines for decades, and our family had the markers they wanted. He actually believed this garbage about creating a master race through selective breeding. The man who taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework was sitting there spouting racist eugenics theories like they were scientific facts. I kept waiting for him to laugh and say it was all a test, but his eyes stayed serious and cold. He told me I should be grateful for the opportunity to contribute my genetics to something bigger than myself. That night at dinner, they announced Desmond wouldn't be joining us anymore because he'd been 15 minutes late to morning exercises. Garrison dragged his stuff out of the dorm while we ate, and nobody said anything about where he went. The message was clear to everyone watching. 3 days later, they held what they called a midpoint ceremony in the main hall, with all the robed members forming a circle around us remaining husbands. They brought out silver cups filled with dark red wine, and Elder Mother said we needed to drink to show our commitment. The liquid smelled weird and metallic, and I knew something was wrong with it. When they weren't looking, I held the wine in my mouth and spit it into my napkin bit by bit. The other guys started swaying and looking confused after drinking theirs, but I stayed steady and pretended to feel the same effects. After the ceremony, they sent us to help unload supplies in the delivery bay, and I saw stacks of wooden pallets getting ready to ship out. While the guard checked something on his clipboard, I grabbed a nail from the floor and scratched "Help Us Cult Compound" into the underside of one pallet. Maybe whoever unloaded it at the destination would see it and call someone. 2 days later, different police officers showed up for another wellness check, and this time one of them pulled me aside near the bathroom. He asked if I was okay, and I tried to explain we were being held against our will, but he kept asking for evidence. I showed him the bruises on my arms from when guards grabbed me, but he said that wasn't enough proof of anything illegal. He handed me his card and said to call if I had concrete evidence of crimes, but then Suzanne appeared with paperwork showing everything was legal. The officers left after 20 minutes, and I felt more trapped than ever. That evening, during our supervised computer time, I got an email notification on the shared terminal. Kirsten had forwarded me a link to an article by Imani Fields about coercive breeding cults operating in multiple states. The article used anonymous sources, but described situations exactly like ours, and mentioned women being used as vessels for selective breeding programs. Within an hour, Suzanne issued a statement denying everything and threatening legal action against the journalist. The next morning, they woke us up early and started searching everything we owned. They found notebooks and pens hidden in mattresses and behind furniture and confiscated all of it. I managed to grab my compound map from under my bed and stuff it into an air vent before they got to my area. They announced new restrictions limiting us to the dorm and dining hall only with no more delivery bay access. During our next clinic visit, I convinced the nurse I needed to use the bathroom urgently and grabbed the desk phone while she was distracted. Kirsten answered on the second ring and started talking fast about escape routes and safe places to run if I ever got out. She taught me to say specific code phrases if I called 911, like mentioning I was in immediate physical danger and needed extraction. She said to head for any fire station or hospital emergency room, since they had to help regardless of the situation. The nurse started coming back, so I hung up and pretended to be looking for paper towels. Over the next week, I started paying attention during our medical van rides to the clinic. We always stopped at the same gas station on Highway 47, and the guard always went inside for coffee while the driver stayed with us. The coffee run took about 3 minutes, and there was a busy road with traffic right next to the pumps. If I could get out and run during that window, I might make it to the road before they caught me. At our next clinic appointment, I sat by the van door and kept my hand near the handle. When we pulled into the gas station, I watched the guard walk inside and counted to 10. I yanked the door open and jumped out running as hard as I could toward the highway. My feet hit the pavement and I pumped my arms trying to get distance from the van. I made it maybe 20 feet before something slammed into me from behind. Garrison tackled me onto the concrete, and my knee twisted sideways with a horrible popping sound. Pain shot up my leg as he grabbed my arms and started dragging me back to the van. People at the gas pumps just stared while I screamed for help, but nobody moved to intervene. The driver helped Garrison throw me into the van, and they slammed the door while I clutched my knee and tried not to vomit from the pain. They drove me back to the compound with my knee throbbing so bad, I kept blacking out for seconds at a time. The medical staff wrapped it in ice and gave me pills that barely touched the pain, while elder mother stood over me shaking her head like I was a kid who'd broken the rules. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about how much easier it would be to just stop breathing than keep living like this. The pain in my knee mixed with the pain of knowing my parents chose this cult over me, and I started thinking about ways to make it all stop. But something made me remember that hotline number I'd memorized, and at our next clinic visit I grabbed the phone while the nurse stepped out. Kirsten answered and I whispered that I was thinking about ending things, and she talked fast about how surviving was its own form of resistance. She said every day I stayed alive was a day closer to freedom, and we made a plan to try again with better preparation next time. Meanwhile, Imani was working on her story and found someone who'd escaped from the organization years ago and got them to talk on record. The former member described the same breeding program and control tactics, which gave her story real weight that people couldn't ignore. 2 weeks passed before my knee healed enough for another clinic trip, and this time I noticed a car following our van at a distance. At the gas station, I recognized Imani's face behind the wheel, and when I went to the bathroom, I found a prepaid phone taped under the toilet tank. She must have planted it there, knowing our routine, and I shoved it in my underwear before anyone noticed I was gone. That night in the dorm, I waited until everyone was asleep, then crawled into the bathroom and started recording everything on voice memos. I whispered names and dates and locations and every crime I'd witnessed during my time there. The breeding program and forced marriages and how they held us against our will with armed guards. I wanted to call 911 right then, but knew I needed more proof, so I sent all the recordings to Imani's number instead. The next morning, Suzanne showed up with a stack of papers saying I'd violated my marriage contract and various NDAs. She filed civil suits demanding hundreds of thousands in damages and threatened restraining orders against anyone who tried to help me. The legal threats felt overwhelming, but I was past the point of caring what they did to me. My parents came for their monthly visit, and I decided I was done playing along with their sick game. When they sat down across from me, I simply stood up and announced I was leaving, then walked straight toward the exit. Garrison followed me into the parking lot trying to grab my arm, but I kept walking toward the street. There was a convenience store across the road, and I ducked inside yelling for the staff to call police because I was being held against my will. The clerk looked confused, but called 911 while Garrison stood at the door trying to convince everyone I was having a mental breakdown. When the cops arrived, they separated us and asked what was happening, and I clearly stated I wanted to leave and was prevented. Garrison showed them papers saying I'd signed voluntary commitment forms, but I kept repeating I wanted to go, and they couldn't legally stop me. The officers said if I was stating I wanted to leave, then they had to let me go regardless of what papers existed. I walked away with just the clothes on my back, but for the first time in over a month, I was actually free. From a payphone outside, I called Kirsten, who gave me directions to a domestic violence shelter that accepted men. The address was 20 minutes away by bus, and when I arrived, they gave me a bed and a hot meal and didn't ask too many questions. That night, I slept without guards watching me or cameras recording me or anyone controlling when I could eat or use the bathroom. The next day, I met Imani at a coffee shop and gave my first on-record interview with all the documentation I'd gathered. She took photos of my twisted knee that still hadn't healed right and the bruises on my arms from where Garrison had grabbed me. I told her everything about the breeding program and multiple marriages and how my own parents had raised me for this purpose. She recorded it all and said the article would run within days and might finally get real authorities involved. The morning after the interview, a process server found me at the shelter with more papers from Suzanne. She was suing for breach of contract and defamation and demanding hundreds of thousands in damages I didn't have. The shelter connected me with legal aid lawyers who said they'd seen this intimidation tactic before with abuse victims. They promised to help fight the lawsuits and said the organization was just trying to scare me into silence, but it wouldn't work. I spent the next few days working with the lawyers to prepare our defense, while also helping Imani fact-check her article. The next morning, I walked into the police station with a folder full of everything I'd collected and asked to file a report for fraud and coercive control. The detective who took my statement kept stopping me to ask for clarification because the whole thing sounded so crazy, but I showed him the marriage certificates and the photos of my injuries and the compound layout I'd drawn. He typed everything up slowly and told me these cases were really hard to prosecute, especially with rich organizations that had lawyers, but he'd send it to the fraud division and see what they could do. 3 days later, Imani's article went live on the front page of the news website with my full interview and quotes from the former member who'd escaped years ago. Within hours, the organization's donors started pulling their funding and issuing statements about being shocked by the allegations. Raven released her own statement through Suzanne, calling me mentally unstable and saying I was a bitter ex-husband making up stories for attention. The organization denied everything and threatened to sue the newspaper, but Imani had done her homework, and the lawyers cleared the story. I spent the next week trying to reach the other husbands still trapped using the numbers I remembered, but most went straight to voicemail, and the few who answered whispered they couldn't talk and hung up immediately. Only Cordell sent me a single text, saying they'd been moved to different facilities after my escape, and security was even tighter now. My legal aid lawyer filed paperwork for a protection order, and 2 weeks later we went to court where the judge granted it after seeing all my evidence. It was just a piece of paper that said Raven and anyone from the organization had to stay away from me. But having it made me feel like the law was finally on my side, even if just a little bit. 6 weeks after my escape, I was living in a tiny sublet apartment above a grocery store and working night shifts at a warehouse loading trucks. My parents had chosen the cult over me and wouldn't return my calls, so I was completely alone for the first time in my life. But at least I was building something real with my own hands and my own choices. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I took 2 buses to see Kirsten at the counseling center, where we worked through the nightmares and the way I still jumped whenever someone walked up behind me. She taught me breathing exercises and helped me create a daily routine that reminded me who I was outside of what they'd tried to make me. Having structure helped, and slowly I stopped waking up in cold sweats thinking I was back in that dormitory. I spent my days off at the library using their computers to compile all my evidence into organized packets, with cover letters explaining everything. I printed multiple copies and mailed them to the FBI field office and the state attorney general and 3 different cult watchdog groups that had websites about helping victims. Maybe nothing would come of it, but I couldn't stop thinking about Desmond and the others still trapped, and if my evidence could help even one person get out, then it was worth the postage. One morning I stood at the bus stop watching regular people heading to their regular jobs, and it hit me that I was one of them now. Just another person waiting for the bus to go to work at a normal job where nobody controlled when I ate or slept or who I talked to. The organization still existed somewhere out there, and Raven was probably already hunting for new husbands to trap, but they didn't own me anymore. My knee still hurt when it rained, and I still had trust issues that would probably take years to work through, but I'd taken back my life and built something new from nothing, and that victory was mine to keep forever. The bus pulled up and I climbed on with everyone else heading to another ordinary day of freedom. That's today's story, but the fun part's hearing all your takes. Share them in the comments, I'll be checking.